Hello and welcome to this video on religion, social change and the postmodernist theory of religion. Similar to Weber, Steve Bruce was interested in the relationship between religion and social change, in particular social protest. He compared two religiously inspired movements which sought to change American society, namely the American Civil Rights Movement and the New Christian Right. The ACRM was in operation in the 1950s and 60s, and it sought to end racial segregation in the United States of America, in particular between white Americans and African Americans. Now, whilst slavery had been abolished in 1865, slavery had previously been a key part of American society and its economy, and its long shadow very much was still cast over America in the 50s and 60s, and to an extent you could say even so today, whereby we saw blacks were segregated in schools, in shops, in buses, in toilets, and so on. So you would often have two communities living side by side but never interacting with one another. So much so that in some states interracial marriages were forbidden and blacks were excluded from voting. In 1955, Rosa Parks refused, very famously, to sit in a black seat on a bus, and this began a process of what was known as direct action, whereby the ACRM sponsored marches, boycotts and demonstrations to get their word out, to get their story out, to get their kind of aims and objectives out there into American society and try and get some traction on the political plane. Interestingly, black clergy members played a pivotal role in this. Very famously, Dr. Martin Luther King was one of the key leaders of the ACRM. These black clergy members provided support, meeting places and sanctuary from white violence through the use of prayer and hymns. The black clergy shamed whites by appealing to Christian values, and this message eventually went nationwide and found support. In this sense, religion acted as an ideological resource or inspiration which could be drawn upon by the protesters to get their message across. Bruce identifies several tools which religious organisations used during the American Civil Rights Movement's active years to contribute to social change in America. Firstly, they used the moral high ground. Ideas from the Bible, such as love thy neighbour, did not fit with the concept of racial segregation as it was at the time. Channeling dissent by religion being a great focalising agent, bringing people together and really sort of thinking about specific ideas. So Martin Luther King's funeral was a good rallying point for people who were anti-segregation. Acting as an honest broker, religion being respected by both sides, both white and black, it therefore meant it could act as a shared context for discussion, bringing people together for that chat, and mobilising public opinion. So black churches and the preachers within those churches preached from pulpits to a captive audience of people who had to listen to the message of it's time to end segregation. So Bruce sees the American Civil Rights Movement as an example of religion being involved in a secular struggle, a non-religious struggle, which is ending segregation, reaching out to a sympathetic audience, and ultimately embodying the American Constitution, the idea of each man, woman and child being born free. Bruce's second example is the New Christian Right, whose aim was to take America back to God and make things like abortion, homosexuality, gay marriage and divorce illegal, turning the clock back to a time before what they considered the liberalisation of American culture and society had begun. They believed strongly in traditional family values and traditional gender roles, and campaigned for the teaching of creationism rather than evolution in schools, and they also wanted to ban sex education in schools, leaving it to parents to decide when they should teach their children about that. They made very effective use of the media. Some of the churches involved actually owned television stations and used these to raise funds and broadcast programs whose aim was to recruit new members. Right-wing Christian pressure groups have since become the focus of much political campaigning. In particular, they have strong links, and they've strengthened those links more recently with the Republican Party. However, the New Christian Right movement has been largely unsuccessful, especially in comparison with the American Civil Rights Movement. And this is because, Bruce says, its campaigners find it difficult to cooperate with people from other religious groups, even when campaigning on the same issues such as abortion. So, most of the NCRM were Christian, and whilst you'd have other religious groups, maybe even Muslims, who might share in common lots of the kind of beliefs and ideas, they were unwilling to work with them. It's very much a kind of Christian-only type movement. It also lacked widespread support and met with strong opposition from groups who who stand for freedom of choice. Arguably, one of the key kind of concepts at the heart of American society and culture is that of liberty, freedom from, well, groups and organisations and, of course, the state telling you what to do. And so suddenly this movement sort of saying that people have got it wrong and we need to turn the clock back and go back to the way things were and, stick to the Bible and so on, didn't really fit with many people's kind of live and let live more attitude when it came to difference and diversity in society. So Bruce concludes the new Christian right movement was a failed movement for social change. So it shows that it doesn't always work, but you do have these movements for social change. Returning to the modernist theory of Marxism, we saw previously how Marxism, and in particular the work of Karl Marx himself, argued that actually religion was a conservative force in society. But not all Marxists buy into this idea. There is some sort of discussion and debate within Marxism as a perspective. Engels, who was Karl Marx's best friend, argued that although religion inhibits change, so it is a conservative force, by disguising inequality, it can also challenge the status quo and encourage social change. So, for example, religion sometimes preaches liberation from slavery and misery, and we see this in the Bible. In the Old Testament, the idea of Moses leading the Jews out of Egypt. This is the idea of ending tyranny and ending slavery and moving into a promised land of freedom. Also, although senior clergy usually support the status quo, it's not unusual for lower ranks within the church hierarchy to support or even inspire organised popular protest groups, often against perhaps more dictatorial or tyrannical governments. Ernst Bloch argued that religions offer people the idea of a better sort of society, that Marxism very much talks about a utopian or a perfect society, and you see this in religion as well. There's that idea of the kingdom of God being a perfect society. While Bloch, as an atheist, thought that religious faith was misplaced, he did see in it a hope for a better sort of society and a belief that people should be able to have dignity in their lives and live a good life, a good quality of life. Therefore, hope for a better world in religious belief can influence the desire for better things on earth and can help rally people to organise and to bring about revolutionary social change. So essentially saying there are revolutionary ideas within religious sort of thinking if it has that kind of utopian thought of wanting to create a better world. Otto Maduro argued that liberation theology, which is a combination of the teachings of Jesus Christ and Karl Marx, had encouraged people to actively change society in Central and Southern America. Liberation theology states that far from being the passive recipients of aid from richer countries, it was essential that the poor themselves should organise and overthrow oppressive regimes that impoverish and exploit them. And this is an example of religion providing what Antonio Gramsci calls a counter-hegemony, in which the ruling class hegemony can be challenged by presenting to oppressed people the vision of an alternative and more just organisation of society. So what Maduro is essentially saying is, liberation theology, a bit of Christianity, a bit of Marxism, was telling essentially the proletariat in South and Central America that it was their job to change their situation in life, not just rely on, say, aid or people outside the state to help them, and that they should behave in a revolutionary way, both in terms of their Christianity and their Marxism, to make a better society, perhaps a socialist or a communist society, but also bring about the kingdom of God on earth. Biblical teachings speak of Christ's imminent return in 1,000 years or a millennium. And so millenarian movements have popped up around the world at different times and are an example of the desire to change things on earth at present and bring about the kingdom of God, often by poor exploited groups. You generally find these in the parts of the world where colonialism and empire at the hands of European nations have been most brutal, bloody and violent. Millenarian movements combine traditional beliefs with Christianity, uniting tribal groups into mass movements. These were the precursor to the political movements which would eventually overthrow colonial rule in the middle of the 20th century. And for Marxists, they are a good example, possibly even the first example, of an awakening of proletarian self-consciousness, an awareness that they were being exploited, in this case by European empires, and that they needed to rise up, overthrow those empires, and create a more fair, just society based on the teachings of Christ, but also kind of Marxist ideas too. So there's a kind of thin connection there also to liberation theology. Dwight Billings looked to apply Gramsci's ideas of hegemony and religion in a case study comparing class struggle in two communities, one of coal miners and the other of textile workers in Kentucky during the 1920s and 30s. Both were working class and both were evangelical Protestants, so a form of Christianity, but the miners were much more militant, struggling for recognition of their union and for better working conditions, while the textile workers accepted the status quo, the situation as it is. Following Gramsci, Billings argues that the differences in levels of militancy, so how kind of committed to the cause perhaps one group were versus the other, can be understood in terms of hegemony and the role of religion. Billings identifies three ways in which religion either supported or challenged the employer's hegemony or dominance. Firstly, leadership. The miners benefited from the leadership of organic intellectuals, again a Gramscian term, the clergy who helped to convert the miners to the union cause. Textile workers lacked such leadership. Next, organisation. The miners were able to use independent churches to hold meetings and organise, whereas the textile workers lacked these spaces. Thirdly, support. The churches kept miners' morale high with supportive sermons, prayer meetings and group singing. By contrast, textile workers who engaged in union activity met with opposition from local church leaders. Billings concluded that religion can play a prominent oppositional role in these sorts of movements. His study shows that the same religion can be called upon either to defend the status quo in the kind of traditional Marxist sense or justify the struggle to change it in a slightly more neo-Marxist sense. Next, we need to consider religion as a source of conflict. Now, perhaps most famously, religious fundamentalism has been something which has really exemplified this in recent years. It means returning to the fundamentals or the basics of any religion, usually based on a literal interpretation of a sacred text or book. Religious fundamentalism exists within many different world religions. So, for example, the New Christian Right, as mentioned previously in the United States, Jewish fundamentalism, otherwise known as Zionism, in Israel, Islamic fundamentalism found in various Muslim countries as well as communities around the world, and Hindu fundamentalists in India. Steve Bruce argued fundamentalism involves a range of key characteristics. Firstly, literal interpretations of the sacred texts, the belief that a Messiah will return and put the world to rights or bring it to an apocalyptic end. Thirdly, hostility towards other beliefs and other belief systems, being opposed to secularization, the decline of religion, and modernization. Next, the desire to reshape the world in accordance with a specific set of beliefs. And finally, the use of violence, so for example, bombing abortion clinics or jihad, which means struggle in Arabic. Fundamentalism often emerges as a response to perceived threats to traditional religious beliefs, such as modernization, liberalization, science, or globalization. Examples of recent conflicts which have been spawned by religious fundamentalism include the Iranian Revolution back in the late 70s, the war in Afghanistan at the beginning of the noughties, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which arguably has been going on for the best part of 70 years, if not longer, and of course the work of Daesh, otherwise known as ISIS or ISIL, in the Middle East in the last 5 years. Postmodernist perspectives of religion is somewhat different than the modernist perspectives we've looked at previously, and they very much buy into this argument that religion is a kind of force for change. Even if it doesn't necessarily mean changing society, it could just mean that religion almost is a force for changing itself or modifying itself to fit the needs of a changing society. Postmodernist sociologists would argue that all previous modernist theories are now out of date and can no longer explain religion and its behaviour in contemporary society. In a world characterised by globalisation and rapid social change, it is more difficult to ascertain the role religion plays, and attempts at a single, monolithic or holistic explanation are likely to fail. Postmodernists identify a number of ways in which religion's behaviour can be understood to have changed. The decline of meta-narratives. So, belief has become fragmented. Individuals are now far less willing to accept what religious authorities say they should believe. In fact, individuals are far more likely to have a diversity of beliefs. This is to say that individuals are picking and choosing from an almost pick and mix selection of different beliefs They are spiritual shoppers who shop around and they make their own belief systems rather than buying into a single meta-narrative that is an overarching story. Next, religion as a consumer product. Religion has declined as a source of collective identity. It's no longer something that brings people together in the way it once did. People don't necessarily kind of identify as a specific identity, religious identity, in the way they did in the past. Instead, religion has become simply another consumer product, a source of individual identity, something to help build that sense of self. And so again, we blend beliefs of all kinds, whether that be from established faiths, religious sects and cults, or New Age spirituality to help build our own individual sense of self. The rise of a global spiritual marketplace. Baudrillard argues that we now live in a global society which is media saturated. That is to say that the media is in every facet of our lives. And one of the key kind of features of the media is its desire to kind of advertise products and services. And we as individuals see ourselves primarily now as consumers in the same sense in the spiritual marketplace as we do in kind of the marketplace when we're buying any other good or service. So the global market now extends to religion, and we shop around for what suits us and we'll enjoy it for as long as it suits us. But if we're no longer happy with that product or service, we will shop around and go to perhaps a different product or service, or indeed a different religion. And so this behaviour of consumers in a marketplace we're seeing in religion in a way that perhaps we didn't in modernist or the modern era. The vacuum of meaning. Bauman argues that there has been a crisis of meaning in the postmodern world. And as a result, this has led to a rejection of traditional religious meta-narratives or big stories. We no longer buy into the meanings behind those big stories found within religion. Instead, individuals are searching for new sources of meaning, purpose and identity, and are far more likely to explore lots of different religious ideas and lots of different belief systems before concocting their own personalised belief system or religious belief. The Disneyization of religion. Blending religion, consumerism and popular culture together has led to a Disneyization of religion, which places an emphasis on fun and amusement and the selling and buying of religion as kind of a fun fantasy world to enjoy, very similar to what we would think about when we were attending maybe Disney World or Disneyland to have a fun-filled day of family fun. And we now kind of expect that from religion. We expect to be entertained, and if we're not entertained, then once again we will shop around to find the religion that will entertain us. That's it. Thank you very much.